It is a pleasure to be with you. Hello again. My name is Pastor Damien, Bread of Life Fellowship, and doing this hopefully brief video that will address a topic that's very near to me, both as a pastor and as a social studies teacher, and something that the elders at our church have agreed is something that we need to address and just try to be helpful with just a few pointers on how we as Christians can discern between the wealth of information that we're bombarded with each and every day, regardless of whether you're on social media or you are on the internet, or if you cut all those things out, maybe you listen to cable news or the radio, read the newspapers, it can really be overwhelming, not only because we're bombarded with information from a variety of sources, but oftentimes a variety of Christian sources, even sources that come from people that you trust. And what do you do when one Christian that you trust very much gives you an article or shares a video or posits an idea that is in complete or the complete opposite of what another trusted Christian friend gives to you? It can be very overwhelming. And so we thought it'd be helpful to go through just a few principles that would help us to slow down a little bit, to take a deep breath, to ask ourselves, is this something that I should believe? Is this something that I should share? Do I need to sound the alarm or do an email blast or text everyone or share this thing on Facebook or Twitter? Or is it something that I can engage in a little more of a thoughtful way? So this session is called Discerning and Sharing Sources, Engaging Information in a Reasonable and Biblical Way. And why does it matter that we talk about this? This is not going to be a Bible study, although I will weave biblical principles throughout this session. And at the very end, our last slide, I will give 7 biblical principles for how then we apply these things when it comes to talking about these things with our fellow believers. Well, first and foremost, Christians are called to reject false witness and testify to the truth, right? You shall not bear false witness is one of the most basic commandments God gives us, because God himself is truth. And let's face it, there are many lies in this world. Satan is the father of lies. The world is filled with lies, and we tend to sometimes believe lies. It's easier to do that when you have a very strong position about something, and especially in terms of politics or current events, for us to sort of grasp onto things that already confirm our bias. But God expects more from the Christian. The Christian is supposed to deal with truth. And so this matters, because if we are reckless in our reading and sharing of articles and videos and books without discernment, we may implicitly lie. That is, we may not have the intention to lie, but we may wind up sharing information that is filled with dishonesty. And that's something that would bring dishonor to the Lord and be a bad testimony. We're called in the Bible to prove all things and to use discernment. And these principles don't just apply to the theological, Bible studies and which heretic to avoid and what is false teaching. Of course, that's primary in this discussion, but what about the dissemination of information? What about the things that we're seeing each and every day about COVID-19 and theories that are out there about the government and about China and about Italy and about, is it worse than the flu? Is it more dangerous than the flu? There are all these things, and my goal tonight is not in any way to tell you what you need to believe about those things, but rather give you some time-tested principles to remember as you read, as people you love share things with you. You're not going to be able to read everything, of course, but at least if you apply these things, it may help you to not be overwhelmed by this bombardment of information. The task is becoming more complicated given the proliferation of information online. Right? Let's face it, when you go on the internet, it is like you're just a walking target for billboards just coming at you. It's like walking through the mall and a salesman from a kiosk is trying to sell you something, but everybody is coming from every which way and you don't know who to believe. But you see some of your friends over here because they like that thing, and some of your friends are over there because they like that thing. And It's so overwhelming. And who are we to believe? What's the truth? And so the task is becoming more and more complicated because online, the internet has intensified the amount of research that's needed to parse through every given thing. And furthermore, and this is very relevant, this is why we're doing this evening, is because of today's uncertain climate. It's contributed to anxiety and overwhelmedness. If you knew as a pastor, people that reach out to me and talk to me about the things that they hear and see their friends posting and sharing, or something that someone emailed to them, or something they saw on TV, well, what do I believe? What do I believe? Is the virus a man-made thing? Is this the government's desire to persecute Christians? Are we being lied to? Are we not able to trust anyone in the White House? Can we trust anyone in the CDC? Can we trust? And some people are overwhelmed, and you could understand why. There's a lot of uncertainty. There are things we just don't know. And yet, despite all that, there are some people that are very certain. I mean, they know, and they act like they know. And if you challenge them, you will be called names. You will be told to, that you're asleep or whatever it is. And it could also be kind of intimidating. And so we're addressing this to sort of ease the anxiety of people who are humble and teachable. If you're someone you made up your mind, you already know what's behind all this, you're convinced, you know it, this isn't really for you, because unfortunately you're not going to take much of what I say. But if you're someone who is teachable and humble and wants to know how to apply some proven tools of research, some very basic things that anybody can do, then this is for you, and I hope it helps. And finally, decisions about reacting to certain issues necessitate that we cut through the unhelpful material that's out there. You might say, it doesn't matter. Like, I'm just going to turn off. I'm not going to go on social media. I'm not going to read the blogs. I'm not going to watch cable news. I'm not going to read the newspaper. I'm not going to listen to the radio. If that's what you choose to do, you do that. But this is important because decisions have to be made. Let's face it. Pastors have to decide, do we open church? Do we not open church? Do we comply with everything the government says? Do we comply with some of what the government says? Do we treat the government as though they're being tyrannical and not obey what the government says? And if you don't know this, many pastors and churches are making different decisions. Are we going to have drive-in service or not? You say, well, I'm not a pastor, it doesn't apply to me. Well, when there's a vaccine available, will you vaccinate? Will you not vaccinate? These are questions you'll have to ask. Do you go outside and wear a mask? Do you not go outside and wear a mask? And again, none of what I'm saying in this video is meant to lead you to one conclusion or another in any of those things, but it's to help you to thoughtfully engage with the things that you read, not so that you can arrive at an answer with 100% certainty. If you're looking for that, I can't offer that to you. We're never going to be 100% certain. Only God can be 100% certain about these things. But if I can help you to at least learn how to reject certain articles or how to parse through information with a little bit more confidence, then I think we've accomplished our goal. At the end of the day, if we can prevent sharing things that are unhelpful, I think we've done some good. So let's get to it. I've been a social studies teacher for over 10 years. I don't claim in any way, shape, or form to be an expert. Sometimes I surprise myself with how far I've gone in passing my certification test, because quite frankly, I know people who are history buffs that don't have the so-called training I have, who can outwit me in any historical topic. So I feel very behind in many things, and I don't mean to come off in any sort of condescending way, but I mean to say, when I was a teacher, I had to grade my students' papers. And grading papers, although it was something I, on one hand, hated doing, on the other hand, was more fulfilling to me to grade a research paper than it was to grade, let's say, a multiple choice paper. And I would tell my students right up front in every beginning of every year, in every social studies class, whether it be world history or US history, sociology, you name it, I would say, as teenagers, your job is to be a good arguer. And they would look at me like, what are you talking about? But I said, yeah, I mean, you do that for a living, right? You're teenagers. That's what you do. You argue with your parents. You argue with your siblings. What we're going to do in this class is we're going to learn how to argue well. So I wasn't the teacher that necessarily taught my students how to memorize the presidents in order or the states and the capitals. There's a time and a place for those things. But at the end of the day, doing social studies was the ability to make a good argument with research that backed it up. And I would tell them sometimes, look, if the conclusion you draw is different than the conclusion that I drew, I'm grading you on your ability to get to that conclusion, not necessarily on the conclusion itself. And I'm talking, of course, about historical things and different theories of history and circumstances, opinions, basically. I'm talking about opinions. I hope you understand. I'm not talking about some relativism where there is no conclusion. There are many things for which we have a conclusion, and the only ultimate source of authority for that is the Word of God. But when it comes to people asking questions like, should the United States have revolted against England? Should we have dropped the atomic bomb? Those classic questions you get on the SAT. The person grading the SAT isn't looking for the right answer. They're looking for you to argue well. And that's what this is about. Even though what I'm talking about today is not history, it sort of is, because we are digging into information and we're trying to parse through it and figure out, is this article, has this YouTube video actually made the case for what it's claiming? If so, it's worthy of our inspection. If not, then we need to discard it and move on, because not everybody can be right. And so there are many things I've taught my students over the years, as I myself have learned and been taught. But if I can narrow it down to 3 major things, this is what I want to talk about tonight. So when you are given an article, you see one online, you hear something on the radio, 3 things to remember. 1, discern the source. 2, discern the argument. 3, discern your heart. We need, as Christians, discernment. Discernment means the ability to distinguish between good and bad, right and wrong, what's helpful, what's not helpful. And these are basic guidelines to help you sort out the unhelpful and consider whether or not you should share, whether or not you should believe that article. And I really hope that this is helpful. I've narrowed these 3 topics down with 3 quotes. Discern the source. Check your sources and your sources' sources. Number 2, discern the argument. Does the evidence lead to the conclusion? And number 3, discern your heart. Evaluate yourself. So let's look at the first one. I'll take probably the most time working on the first one. And I have this slideshow here so that if any time you need to pause it, it will be helpful to digest what's happening, because I'm going to put a lot of bullet points on here, but I don't have time and I don't want to bore you with going through each and everything. And again, this is not an exhaustive list by any means. Number 1, I had a professor in college who used to say, check your sources and your sources' sources. I cannot stress how important this is. Historians, journalists, people who do the academic work, they really care about sources. Sources mean a lot, meaning what website did you get this from? What YouTube channel? What commentator? This is the first step in deciphering whether or not the thing that you're reading is credible. Now, I'm going to give a lot of disclaimers throughout this because I know how this can be misinterpreted. In no way am I suggesting that truth must always come from sources that the majority of people deem credible. Of course, there are instances, and there have been instances throughout history, where the so-called establishment got it wrong, and it took a few non-credible or unknown sources to give us the truth. That will happen, and just remember what I said in the very beginning. None of this is to give you 100% certainty, but I believe that most of the time it will help you cut out that which is unhelpful. It's very important not just to check sources for credibility, but also just to know what type it is, because the knowing what type of source you're reading will help you discover whether something is worth believing or not. So the first question you want to ask in checking your sources is, what type of source is it? Listen, you probably heard the old adage in church that going to church doesn't make you a Christian any more than standing in a garage makes you a car. Well, you know what? Going to the library doesn't make you a researcher. It just doesn't. And I've seen too many examples of people saying, do your research, people. But you know what? You can spend hours going down rabbit holes on YouTube. It doesn't matter what the quantity is of the time that you literally sit in front of a screen or stand in the library. If you're not doing your research right, it doesn't matter. And so it's not a matter of how much you've read or how much you've listened to. It's a matter of how you process it. And I hope that this is helpful. So one of the things I've always taught my students is, first we have to consider the source. Is it a primary or secondary source? A primary source means it came from the time of or from the person who actually said that thing. A diary written by a historical figure is a primary source. A newspaper article from the day after something happened is a primary source. But a biography written about a historical figure 100 years after he or she died, of course, is a secondary source. Now, primary doesn't mean better, but it will help you to distinguish between what someone actually said and what someone said that they said. I'll give you an example of something I saw recently, and I see stuff like this all the time. Perhaps you have as well. One of my friends shared a YouTube video. The title of the YouTube video was, and I quote, "Bill Gates says we will not have public gatherings until everyone is vaccinated." And it was shared, and I thought, wow, that is quite an assertion for someone like Bill Gates, who's not an epidemiologist, to make such a bold statement. And of course, I was incredulous. I didn't think he actually said that, but it was a 7-minute video, so I was willing to give it a shot. Click on the video, and admittedly didn't watch the whole thing because it was a clip of what he said, then someone's commentary, and then they went back to the clip of what he said, and then more commentary, and so I assumed that it was just that one clip. And in that clip, Bill Gates said something like this. He said, "I don't think we're going to return to normal until a vaccine is available to the whole world." So I asked my friend, I said, I didn't watch the video unless I'm missing something. It doesn't seem like Bill Gates actually said what the headline says that he said. Now, the friend that posted it was someone who, motorcycle. The friend that posted it was someone who was humble enough to take the video down. Thankfully, didn't dig his heels in. But you see the problem with that? The primary source is what Bill Gates actually said. He said that a vaccine needs to be available to the world. The headline said that everyone must get vaccinated. Now, you might think one leads to the other. You might think there's some agenda there. But when you misquote people and then say, he said this thing, when he actually didn't say this thing, you're being dishonest. And if we share those things, or if you comment and say, oh, I can't believe he said that, without actually watching the video, you are engaging in dishonesty as well. So it's very helpful. And I think to me, this is one of the most helpful things, is because a lot of articles begin with headlines that say, so-and-so says, Mr. Jones said this, Mr. Smith said that. So I would suggest, please read the article and look what Mr. Jones or Mr. Smith actually said. And then look at the context, because what they said may not be the conclusion of the author who shared it. The second thing is credible or questionable. Credible or questionable. Now, this is the one where I think it's really impossible to be completely objective, right? Because we're all going to have different standards of what makes something credible or something questionable. Those of us who are more anti-institutional and anti-establishment probably don't think many people are credible, except people who agree with you. And so, again, I just throw this out there. You do with it what you want, but at least examine. If you're reading something, for example, about the coronavirus, is the person who's writing it an epidemiologist? Is it someone who knows about viruses? Have they worked on it? Are they board certified? I mean, look, again, disclaimer. Can there be truth from someone who's not in the establishment? Of course there can. But I don't know about you, but when I fly commercial, I don't look up the biography of my airline pilot. I just trust that United Airlines is regulated enough by the government that they're only going to hire captains who have completed a certain number of hours to be certified in piloting my plane. And if someone stands up and in the middle of the plane and says, I'm going to take over because I can do a better job, well, you know what? I'm not going to trust that guy. Now, are you going to say that there's no example of someone who's not certified, who hasn't gone through the rigor of the academics and the training, who can't be better than a pilot? Of course. I mean, these things exist. We know they exist. We know there are people who are more wise than 10,000 doctors, but they haven't proven themselves. So credibility is really all about proof. If someone has an advanced degree in a certain science, then we could assume, not always, disclaimer, not always, but we could assume that they completed their coursework in their undergrad, they went to grad school, they've read numerous peer-reviewed articles, they've been in the lab, they've worked on that thing, they got to the point where they had to defend a dissertation amongst their professors and eventually get the degree, get board certified, and someone else is going to come here and just write a blog post, and that's going to undo all that research and all that accountability. Which one takes a little bit more faith to believe? And so, by and large, unless you have a reason to discredit someone, I think you have to at least ask the question, is this coming from a credible source or a questionable source? As I'm sure you're aware of some documentaries that are coming out to promote certain theories, they're coming out sometimes by doctors who have been either stripped of their board credentials or who've had articles that were redacted in magazines, and their credibility becomes questioned in their own community. So either you have to believe that their entire medical community is somehow against that one person and they're the whistleblower you must listen to, or maybe there's a reason why so many people in one community have by and large said that person is not trustworthy. Think about that. The third thing is to distinguish news outlets. A lot of the things that we're getting come from news outlets, right? Newspapers, cable news, news websites. And with the internet, another one of the blessings or maybe cursings of the internet is that anyone can claim that he's a journalist. Anyone can claim that he's a news reporter. There are many self-appointed reporters out there. And you have to be careful if you're, just like with the medical thing I was talking about, with the journalist thing. Is this an actual journalist or is this a pundit or so on? So here's a few examples of that. And again, I'm not saying one means it's better than the other, but are you asking this question when you read that article? Does the article come from a local, a national, or an international website? It's a simple question to ask, and it may help you to distinguish some things in the article. Are you reading a newspaper, a magazine, a blog, or what? Right, look at the name of the website. Is it a newspaper? Is it the Daily News, the New York Times? Or is it a magazine that tends to be more opinionated on this or that? Is it someone's personal blog? Again, doesn't mean one is always better than the other, but it's very helpful to know what is it I'm actually reading before I read it, before I share it. Really important, this next point, is it a journalist report or a columnist editorial? Now, I've seen instances where, even in my own classroom, where students will say, according to the New York Times or according to the Wall Street Journal, when they actually are quoting an editorial. You know, an editorial is where a columnist or someone can either be asked by the paper or even in some cases pay to have their article published in an opinion section. Someone writing an opinion for a newspaper isn't the same thing as the newspaper saying something. So distinguish between those two things. Look at where it actually is found in the newspaper. A journalist's article, a headline, is meant to be more objective. Again, I said meant to be. I know some of us will say, but this newspaper is biased. And yes, there is bias. We'll get to that in a moment. But at least distinguish between the purpose of a journalist who is trying to report objectively what happened versus a columnist who is giving an opinion about what happened. And a lot of credible newspapers, whether you like them or not, tell you right up front whether this is news or opinion. So look for those words. And the last thing on this slide is it a news hour or a pundit talk show? And this is the equivalent on cable news as to what I was just talking about in print newspaper. A news hour, you know, with the advent of cable TV and just the proliferation of channels now, what was it, 20 years ago when there was only basically CNN, right? Now there's Fox News, MSNBC, and all these 24-hour news channels, and I guess they have to fill their time, right? There's a difference then between watching a Fox News hour that happens to be, I think it's still on Special Report, or one of those news shows where literally they're just trying to report things to you, right? So on 1 hour, you might be watching a news show. This happened, then this happened. Here's a clip of what happened, then this happened. And then the next show would be like Sean Hannity or Glenn Beck. Well, there's a difference between the news show and the pundit. The pundit is going to be very clear as to where he stands on issues. The news show isn't going to be as clear. Again, is there bias in the news show? Does it come through? All of us are biased. Of course, we get that. But it's important to know there's a difference between what's meant to be objective reporting and what's actually a pundit's basically online or aired column akin to an opinion column in a newspaper. The next thing, and I taught my students this a lot the last couple of years, really, really important, is as you're checking your sources, look for corroboration. All right, so let's say you did everything in slide 1. You examined what the source was. You were able to say, okay, this is a newspaper article. That's what this is from a credible newspaper. All right, now you're going to continue to read now. It's important that you learn to corroborate your source or the opinion or argument of your source before you publish, before you go off sharing this to the whole world. And how do you corroborate? Corroboration simply means that other sources are saying the same thing. Okay, again, disclaimer. Have there been instances, and will there be instances, where there's only one person standing against the world? Yes. Yes. But is that the norm? No. If every major outlet is reporting that one thing happened and someone else says, no, it actually happened this way, who are you going to believe, right? That's why when you were in high school, and I say this as a high school teacher, and you wrote a research paper, didn't your teachers always tell you you must cite at least 5, 6, 7 sources? Look, if you have to write a biography about Abraham Lincoln, and you just use one biography about Abraham Lincoln to write your biography, then you basically just wrote a book report. But if you're going to read, several biographies that have different perspectives on Abraham Lincoln, and then answer one particular question about him in your paper, then you have to practice corroboration. Because in this book it says this, and in this book it says this, but in this book it says this, and I'm comparing my sources, right? So it's really important that if you're going to make a bombastic claim or support or believe a very bombastic claim about what's going on in the world, that you corroborate it with other sources, not just one website, not just one blog post, not just one Facebook post. And in corroboration, what makes it really strong, your argument is really strong when multiple perspectives support the argument. If you're reading a source that is completely pro-Trump, then finding the same thing on other completely pro-Trump websites isn't much corroboration because they're all going to be pro-Trump. If you're reading a source that is completely anti-Trump and everything you find on the anti-Trump sources are all saying the same thing, well, of course, because they're anti-Trump. But if you find a source that happens to be typically pro-Trump and it says the same thing about something that happened as something that's typically anti-Trump, well, you've got some pretty good corroboration in that. So when you have multiple perspectives supporting the same argument, it really strengthens the argument. But that brings us then to detecting bias, right? To be biased or to be partial to something is to favor one thing even before hearing the evidence for both sides. Let's be honest, we're all biased. I'm biased, you're biased. If we don't admit that we're biased, then we're blinded, right? We're blinded, really we are. So as you're reading this, as you're watching this YouTube video, whatever it is that you're doing to get sources and process information, ask yourself, is there anything the author might have to gain here? And then this is the all-important question. How do you know that? You see, a lot of us will focus on this, what might the author have to gain? Because we know the love of money is the root of all evil. So it's very easy for us to dismiss any argument by saying, well, they're just saying that because they want to make money. But how do you know that's true? If you don't have evidence, I would submit to you as a Christian, stop making claims on people's motives. It's so easy to do, isn't it? We've all done it. We have to be aware that we tend to do it. When we say, the only reason he's making this argument, the only reason the government wants us to wear masks, or the only reason that church tells people not to wear masks, or the only reason that church has closed down, and the only reason that church has opened up, and the only reason, unless you know the heart, or you have really good evidence for why someone's doing what they're doing, we should just engage in the actual argument rather than to impugn their motives. But if you do have some good evidence, if you know that someone's producing a video right at the same time that they're releasing their book and they want you to buy their book, and you think, well, that might be some bias. Or if the person has spent their whole life criticizing one particular person or one particular movement, and this is just another video, another article, trying to find dirt on this person, then maybe their bias is showing very clearly, and you can point to that. And so if you think you found bias and you have good evidence for bias, you might want to ask then, how might this bias skew the conclusion? There are a lot of biased books throughout history, right? You've probably heard the expression that the winners write history. And one of the tasks of a social studies teacher is to introduce his students to historical revisionism and primary sources that might change the narrative, right? Well, all throughout history, in the Middle Ages and colonial period, you name it, there are biased sources. So I'm not only talking here about the current events of COVID-19, I'm talking about the discipline of research. The researcher has to try to detect bias while at the same time guarding against his own, and that is no easy task. Speaking of bias, here is what I find to be a helpful chart. The purpose of me showing you this chart is in no way to discredit any one of these companies that you see on the chart. It is also not my intention to say that this website, allsides.com, is as objective as they claim to be. If you're on the far left, you might think they're too far right. If you're on the far right, you might think they're too far left, as is always the case. No one is completely objective. However, based upon some of their own ways of analyzing these news sources, they've come up with a chart that basically says where certain news outlets fit on the spectrum. My goal is not to get into conservative versus liberal or centrist, but to just show you something that I think is interesting. According to this chart, which by the way says right here, ratings do not reflect accuracy or credibility. They're not trying to tell you not to listen to any of these people. But to say, is someone as objective as possible? If they're as objective as possible, they put them in the center column. Like, these guys are just reporting the news. If they lean more towards the right, maybe more of a conservative bent, they would, going out from center, maybe be kind of right of center, or lean more towards the left, a more liberal bent, a little more left of center. And maybe they're really far to the right, very conservative, only conservative voices are heard. That's the far right, or only liberal voices are heard, the far left. Okay. Now, it doesn't mean if you have your source is only from someone in the right or someone in the left, that means the source is not credible. But when it comes to bias and corroboration, it's just important to know what you're dealing with here. Like, for example, on the far right, understand that there are news magazines like Newsmax and the Federalist that are not newspapers, they're magazines, and it's helpful to know the difference between them. But I want to show you something interesting. Like, for example, you see NPR on two different columns. Well, why is that? Why is NPR in the center? I mean, almost everybody knows NPR leans to the left. NPR's liberal, right? But there's a difference that this chart is showing us, a difference between the online news of NPR and the opinion of NPR. One tends to be more objective, and one tends to be more liberal. It's similar with Fox News. I don't think it's a secret that Fox News leans to the right. Their news leans to the right. You can do a simple comparison. Just go to CNN.com, go to FoxNews.com, and see which headlines they choose to show. And it's clear that the Fox News one will lean to the right, and the CNN one will lean to the left. Then why then is Fox News on the far right and CNN also on the far left? Why do they put them twice? Well, same reason. While Fox News in its news reporting leans to the right, their opinion is very right. Between all the pundits they have, it's almost exclusively conservative. And the same is true with CNN. While their reporting might be a little more objective, but lean to the left, their opinion, their pundits, their columnists will almost always be liberal. Now, why is this important? Because when it comes to bias, you at least know where people are coming from. And secondly, for corroboration, if I read a news report, if someone said that Dr. Fauci said that wearing masks will reduce coronavirus contact for 80% of the time or something like that. Well, if it's reported in ABC and it's reported in the AP and it's reported in Fox News, I have just engaged in the academic discipline of corroboration. I've taken opinions from 3 different perspectives. I've compared them. They are all saying the same thing. And so that gives more weight to my argument. Doesn't mean it's 100% correct, but at least it's a little more trustworthy than if I only got something from the far left or if I only got something from the far right. Will we always be able to detect bias? Of course not. But I'm just trying to help you understand that it's important that we are aware of it. All right, like I said, I was going to spend the most time on checking my sources. That was the first thing. Check your sources, check your sources' sources. But now we'll move on to the last couple of points. Number 2 is, does the evidence lead to the conclusion? This is discern the argument, right? We discern the source, now we need to discern the argument, right? And the difference is, in discerning the source, you're talking about where the argument comes from. Newspaper, magazine, bias, not bias, credible, not credible. But now once you've looked at that, now you're actually reading. Now you're actually watching. And the question you need to ask yourself is, does the evidence lead to the conclusion? I think this is where a lot of us, myself included, trip up. If we see the headline, we skim through it, we see a few quotes here and there, sort of point to the headline. But the question is, does it actually lead us to the conclusion? This is something that I've had to discipline myself a lot, especially as a teacher, when my students would hand me their opinion papers, their persuasive essays, using their sources. Did they actually lead me to that conclusion? Or did they make a conclusion, give a few quotes, and then state their conclusion again? That is how a lot of online articles seem to work. One way to do this is to detect logical fallacies. Now, I don't have time to get into all of this. I myself don't claim in any way to have a mastery on this, but if you have time, and I say this as a history teacher who told my students, never use Wikipedia in your sources. By the way, I do think Wikipedia can be a great place for getting links and the links on the bottom. So it's not entirely out of this question, but if you just spend time on a basic website like Wikipedia or something, or Google, logical fallacies, just interact a little bit with some of the basic logical fallacies. It really helps to know how much of these things we use all the time. At Bread of Life, if it's on the website, you can go to bolfellowship.org and look for our media section. I believe it's still up there. Brother Nate Adamo did a whole session in a bold course on logical fallacies, and he gets more in depth than I intend to hear. So it's really, really important. But just for some basic things, look for these logical fallacies. Ad hominem is when you attack the person, right? So if you're writing an article about a political figure, about a scientific figure, and all you're doing is just attacking the person instead of the argument, then you've engaged in ad hominem. And it doesn't matter how many strong words you can use, like nothing you say is actually persuasive. A straw man is when you attack an argument that actually hasn't been made. So you set up an argument that doesn't exist, and then you destroy the argument and you declare yourself the winner, even though the person that you're attacking didn't actually say that thing. The false dichotomy is very, very popular, sometimes called a false dilemma, where you posit that there's only 2 ways, right? If you don't accept my argument, then you must be on the other side. If you criticize Trump, well, then you must be a liberal and you love Hillary. Or if you criticize Obama, then you must be a right-wing conservative and you love Trump. There's only 2 ways to look at this thing, and that's actually not true. Or in the COVID-19 thing, right? If your church is complying with the government, then you're just living in fear and you've allowed the government to be a tyrant. But likewise, a church may make a different decision. And if we say, well, your church is just extreme and you don't care about the lives of people. We're offering only two options. Is there a middle ground? Is there another option? When you say there's only two, you're offering them a false dilemma or a false dichotomy. Things like red herring would be helpful to look up, non sequitur, things that either don't have to do with the argument or don't lead to the conclusion. It doesn't follow, the argument doesn't actually follow. And then circular reasoning. It's like, the headline was made, and then you just do a full circle and come back to the headline, but you actually haven't proven anything in your argument. There are many more very, very common logical fallacies, and that's one way to analyze the arguments that you're reading. And then remember this, and you probably learned this in high school. This was very big for me when I taught criminology, sociology. Correlation versus causation, right? We say this all the time. It's a common phrase, but do we actually believe this, right? Correlation does not prove causation. Just because things correlate doesn't mean one caused the other. You'll see a lot of these theories online about COVID-19 being created in a lab, or Bill Gates is the most popular bad guy right now because Bill Gates he's very pro-vaccine, and he's talked about pandemics breaking out, and so there's a correlation between some of the things he's done as they relate or with today's climate, but yet there hasn't been the so-called smoking gun that proves the causation. So when you say one thing caused another without evidence, all you're really doing is pointing out correlations instead of actual causations. So look at the context in which people say things, the context. When you read quotes, do your best to go back to the original speech, back to the original interview, and understand the context. And then ask this question: does a relationship between things in the article actually prove the argument's conclusion? If you can at least ask that question, I think it will save you a lot of a lot of hardship as you're researching these things. All right, so number one, check your sources. Number two, analyze the argument. And number three, discern your heart. Evaluate yourself. This is the first 2 points might apply to Christians and non-Christians, but this is something Christians we need to really take heed to, right? I mentioned bias. Yeah, news sources have bias, journalists have bias, people on Twitter have biases. I am a biased person, and so are you, right? What is my bias going into this? And how do I evaluate that? Well, you could ask this question: what do I want to be true? We call this confirmation bias. If you've made up your mind, you already believe a certain thing, and somebody shares an article, oh yeah, that's what I agree with. Like, share, everyone needs to read this. That's confirmation bias because you haven't actually done the research. You haven't actually looked at it, right? And then ask yourself, am I open to critique? If I do make the decision to share this thing, whether it be one-on-one or on social media or in an email or a WhatsApp or a text message, am I open to critique? Am I open to someone saying to me, thank you for sharing that article, but here's where I think it falls flat? What do I think of other believers that hold different positions? Oh, that's a hard one, right? Because you're reading this article and you're so into it and you really think, okay, it passes the test, the sources are good, the arguments are good. And you start to think to yourself, I can't believe fellow Christians don't agree with me on this. We'll get to that in a moment. But having asked all these questions, should I share this? And if I do share this, should I share this with or without a disclaimer? You see, at the end of the day, I realize I gave you a lot to chew on here. And for many of us, it's review of like high school history class, right? Nothing novel, nothing revolutionary about what I said. But I don't mean to overwhelm you. At the end of the day, if all I get you to do is just spend 5 more minutes or using Google before you share, then I've done my job. Because if it stops us from sharing things that are not true, then I think we've won. If we're slower, maybe we'll share things with a little more care. Maybe that's where we're going to be. So maybe you don't stop sharing, but instead you share something with a little more humility. Like, oh, this is interesting. I'm not sure if it's true. What are your thoughts on this, folks? I don't know how it would come off, but sometimes we share things and we say, everyone needs to read this. How about the pandemic movie? Watch this before YouTube takes it down. People were sharing it simply because YouTube took it down. I mean, I've seen people say this. YouTube took it down, so it must be true. They skipped like all the other things I told them in numbers 1 and 2. But all joking aside, at the end of the day, it's really a matter of, do I continue to propagate things that might lead people to false conclusions? Look, at the end of the day, I'm not saying that every article has to be perfect. We're all going to share things where if someone really combs through the article you shared or the video you shared with a fine-tooth comb, they're going to find things, right? I'm not saying that you can't share those things. I share things that, I'm sure are not 100% true in all the things, but I think the conclusion is supported by the evidence. I can even preach a sermon, 5 reasons why we should pray. And reasons 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all good reasons. And number 5 is just not accurate. It doesn't mean that I was telling a lie. I mean, we're going to say things that are not accurate, that someone can come along and correct us. And the same is going to be true with articles that we share. There's a difference between sharing an article that has a few things wrong with it, but still gives you a good conclusion, between that and an article that is just completely flawed with its premise and with its conclusion. And so my admonition to you then is to be slow to speak, slow to write, and slow to share. I know that the internet is going at a rapid pace and it's hard to keep up, but if you choose to be on it, whether you have a blog or a Facebook or a Twitter, or maybe you just have email, or you're in a WhatsApp group chat or a text group chat, or you do none of the above, even when you go to church, and Lord willing, we'll be in church again, people will come to you with theories, with ideas, with concepts. And as Christians, we ought to love one another and listen to one another, listen to what's on our brethren's hearts. We have to have a way to process those things. And I would just recommend that at the end of the day, we are slow to speak, slow to write, slow to share. Let me just end with this. Now, what do you do, with two brethren, two Christians, good, solid Christians, whose lives you want to emulate, who are Christ-like in every other way? And one has a polar opposite view than the other. Or what if you find yourself in the midst of a conversation with another brother? We say, well, I did all those things. I checked my sources, I checked the arguments, and I'm going to share this article. And he checked his sources and checked, and he's going to share this article. And those two articles are polar opposites. How do we engage? And I just want to remind you of some basic things that the Bible says to us when we as Christians interact with disagreements. What should our attitude be, right? I mean, social media wasn't around 2,000 years ago, but there were disagreements amongst Christians, amongst believers. There will always be arguments. Some are worth having, some are not, but given the climate, it's important to inject biblical truth into this conversation so that we can honor the Lord in all things. So here's just 7 biblical principles. Number 1, Proverbs 18, 13, and 17 says, if one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. Number 1 is this: don't jump to conclusions. I used to tell my students this all the time. I say, you guys would be great at the Olympics because you're always jumping to conclusions. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't be suckered in by headlines and tabloids. It's such a shame that there are so many so-called Christian websites that run their websites like tabloids with clickbait. Be wary of those articles that try to grab your attention with words, unmasked, revealed, exposed, bombshell, major alert. I mean, how many times I've clicked on these things only to find that it wasn't much of a bombshell. Click on it, read it, engage with it. And then maybe if you find that it is a bombshell, then okay, say it's a bombshell. But just remember the proverb that says it's folly if you give an answer. Don't jump to conclusions. which is tied into the second one, right? Number 2, know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. Are we quick to hear the other side? Slow to speak, slow. Now look, I want to make something clear. I don't believe that there's a moral equivalency. Some people will say, and I've seen this kind of posturing. Someone will say something that's like so crazy outlandish, like just a crazy conspiracy theory, and you say, there's no evidence for this. You're just propagating things that have no evidence. And sometimes they'll respond with, yeah, but we really can't know what's true, so just putting it out there because it might be true. Now, there's truth on both sides. And I think, would you say the same thing about heresy? I mean, honestly, would you say the same thing? Well, I'm just going to promote this really damnable heresy, this legalism, or this works-based righteousness, or this prosperity gospel, and someone comes to you and says, you know what, that's actually not biblical. Would you respond with, well, yeah, it might be true. There's truth on both sides. We can't be. No, of course not. So there is always, of course, there's a time for us to call error what it is and say, look, that thing that you said is not true. But when we've done our research and when we've come to different conclusions, it's still imperative for us to be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. Number 3, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourself. When you're engaging in a disagreement with another believer, do you believe that believer is more significant than you? Because if your only aim is to tear them down, you've got a pride problem. It doesn't really matter what you say. You are not honoring the Lord. Number 4, love bears all things, hopes all things, believes all things. Jesus said we're to love the brethren. If you love the brethren, you will not engage in worldly behavior of taking them out of context, of not letting them clarify their words. Sometimes, you know what? We misspeak. Even high-profile Christian leaders will say things that are not true. And sometimes when they're called on it, they apologize. And there are other Christians who 20 years later will bring up what they said 20 years ago that they already apologized for. So when someone, as a pastor, if I preach something in a sermon and I say something that's off guard, I wouldn't want someone to come up to me and say, you're preaching heresy. I would like for them to say, hey, you said this one thing. What did you mean by that? And maybe they will point out how what I said can be taken the wrong way or can lead to something, but at least I'm asking for the benefit of the doubt. Why? Because you owe it to each other. We are to love one another, and love hopes all things and bears all things and believes all things. We're so quick to write each other off. Number 5, correcting his opponents with gentleness. God may perhaps grant them repentance, leading to knowledge of truth. I hope you understand. Nothing that I'm saying says we can't engage. We're going to have these debates. We debate about modes of baptism and eschatology and all sorts of things within the Christian ranks. Okay, we're going to debate about coronavirus and churches closing and masks wearing. Okay. But are we doing it gently? Are we really asking for God to do a work in the person's heart and in our heart? Because there are some things that we have to be open that we're not right either. Number 6, iron sharpens iron and one man sharpens another. If you are seeking to sharpen someone else, are you yourself willing to be sharpened? And lastly, rather speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. Let love be our motive. Why are you sharing what you're sharing? Is it because you love God, you love truth, and you love God's people? Or is it because you love yourself and you want to vindicate yourself and you want to have power over others? I mean, there are many things we could ask, but it's important that we discern ourselves, and that at the end of the day, as we engage with this proliferation of information, whether it be doctrinal or whether it be about current events, that we don't do it the way the world does it. It's a shame that online Christian behavior is indistinguishable from online talk radio, secular radio. Honestly, it's not any different than the pundits going back and forth, Fox News, CNN. It doesn't sound any different sometimes. And I long for a day where there are Christian leaders coming out of the woodwork who are leading by example on how to engage other Christians when they disagree in the spirit in which we're to do it. And I don't think we're there yet. I don't pretend for any moment that this video is going to get us there. But for those of you from Bread of Life who are listening and watching, I hope it's helpful for us as we determine not to be overwhelmed, not to be anxious, but to be pursuers of truth and to use some very basic principles of research as we try to sort through the incredible amount of information that we're getting. And if at the end of the day, it just causes us to be a little more careful, then I think we're going to be heading in the right place. And so thank you so much for bearing with me in this. I give credit to Slides Carnival for this cool whiteboard and the presentation idea. So thank you all for watching, and God bless you.